This episode is brought to you by Sterling Soap Company. Fellas, you've heard the phrase, look good, feel good, right? But why not add smell good to that too? That's where Sterling Soap Company comes in. First, Sterling Soap is 100% natural and has a wide variety of bath soaps, shave soaps, beard balm, lotions, and cologne. Second, there's a scent just for you. How about burgundy? Yeah, it's more than a color. The Sterling Soap folks blend natural essential oils with hints of mahogany, golden amber, and sandalwood. Or how about D503, an intensely masculine scent inspired by Legend by Mont Blanc. And third, you will feel good about the price. For just a little more than you'd pay at the grocery store, Sterling Soap will leave you feeling clean, refreshed, and ready for whatever's next. Give Sterling Soap a try today. Visit sterlingsoap.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Who that say gonna beat them Saints? Who that?
Oh, when the Saints go marching in. Oh, when the Saints go marching in. You know I want to be in that number. Oh, when the Saints go marching in.
Who that say they gonna beat them Saints? Who that? Who that? Who that say they gonna beat them Saints? Who that? Who that? Who that say they gonna beat them Saints? Who that? Who that? Who that say they gonna beat them Saints? Who that?
Sports from back in the day. From Atlanta, it's Dana on the mic, talking old school legends, bringing history to life. We go deep like a spiral in the Superdome. Back when athletes left the game due to talking alone. Jordan fadeaways, Jackie in the zone, Ali in the ring, man, he stood all alone. From the Negro Leagues to the ABA, we break it all down, yeah, the classic way. It's Charles from the district, straight out the boot. Southern University pride, repping truth in the booth. From Baton Rouge to the nation's capital, legends on deck. Yeah, we factual tales of the greats, gold chains and all. Baseball, who dreams in that football brawl? No clickbait, no fluff, just the facts we say. It's historically speaking, sports from back in the game. So sit back, tune in, and hit replay. It's historically speaking sports, the classic way.
That was the melodious tones of Grammy Award-winning singer and New Orleans native Aaron Neville and a few of the New Orleans Saints players from 1983, which since that time, that song and most notably that chant has been the rallying cry for every New Orleans Saints fan from the Louisiana Gulf Coast to the piney woods of northern Mississippi. Hello again, everyone. This is Dana Augusta, the co-host of the Historically Speaking Sports podcast, the podcast that gives you the best of sports from back in the day. My co-host Charles Combs will be here shortly to discuss, obviously, the New Orleans Saints, but more specifically, the Jim Mora era of the Saints. Now, between the years of 1985 through 1996, the New Orleans Saints had risen from the cellar of the NFL to become a perennial playoff team. Though they never won a playoff game during that time, the Saints, behind quarterback Bobby Hebert and legendary linebacking core known as the Dome Patrol, became one of the NFL's elite teams. And behind it all was the quotable head coach with ties to the USFL, Jim Mora. Later in the show, we'll send a shout out to the Who Dat Chant, a chant which actually became famous in the 1960s thanks to local high school and colleges in the area, but actually predates the NFL itself. And we will settle, sort of, the debate on which came first, the Who Dat Chant in New Orleans or the Who Dey chant in Cincinnati. We have all of that coming up and much, much more on this all-new edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast here on the Sports History Network.
Hey there. Welcome to Music Meets Sports, where sports legends meet custom soundtracks. Founded by music producer Ronald Tyke Oliver, Music Meets Sports was created to bridge generations, educate fans, and celebrate the greatness of both current and former athletes. We craft original songs about heroes in basketball, football, baseball, boxing, and beyond, highlighting their struggles and victories. Across all musical genres, we reintroduce fans to their favorite athletes in a way they've never heard before. From Babe Ruth to Reggie White, from rising WNBA stars to timeless NFL great stream, or download our music now on Apple Music, Amazon, and Spotify. Visit musicmeetsports.org to explore the catalog, hear new releases, and join the movement that's preserving sports history, one song at a time.
Ladies and gentlemen, and we're back here once again with another show coming at you from both the Atlanta area as well as the area of the DMV. I'm Dana Augusta, along with my main man Charles Combs, coming at you once again with another episode here of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, the podcast that gives you the best of sports from back in the day. And for both of us, this subject that we're talking about here tonight is sort of personal, because not only we remember this, but we lived in the area where this was the epicenter of maybe some of the most dramatic changing of the guard, I guess you could say, in the NFL. And it was something that both of us remember very fondly as not only NFL fans, but also residents of South Louisiana. We're talking about the Jim Mora era of the New Orleans Saints, which lasted from 1985 to 1996. And during those 12 years, we saw the ascension of the Saints franchise, quite frankly, in ways that neither one of us actually believed was going to happen in our lifetimes. But because we had seen them flounder for so many years. And to talk more about that once again, my partner in crime, Charles Combs. Chuck, glad to have you aboard with us once again, man. Talk about that era just off the top of your head. What were some of the things that you really remember about that era of the New Orleans Saints history that was, quite frankly, was surprising to not only both of us, to a lot of people down south?
First of all, it's great to be back. I always, kind of missed being on the airwaves. But anyway, on to the task at hand. It was quite honestly shocking, because the Saints, you could argue at the time that the Saints were perhaps not only the worst, without question, the worst NFL franchise. It was between they and the Bucks, but you could argue that they were the worst franchise in professional sports, period. In the Americas, of course, because they were just, perhaps the Cubs in baseball, or they were just that bad and that downtrodden, and their entire history was just colossal failure, the colossal failure. So at that time, it was nearly impossible to even fathom that the Saints could field a competitive team, let alone a winning team. So it was just, quite frankly, shocking, and it was just really, bellum, because people just couldn't believe it for the first time that they were competitive. They were well run, and then even when you watch them play for the first time, they still would do Saints things. It's impossible to exercise all those demons, but they actually wouldn't make the typical Saints mistakes, like running into each other instead of hitting the ball carrier and
Right.
things like that. And just
Right.
so it was just quite refreshing and just unreal.
Well, one of the things that I remember about that era was from a personal level, being growing up in South Louisiana, you were in Baton Rouge, so you were closer to New Orleans than I was. But growing up in the country, as they call it, I can remember like people, like shop owners around South Louisiana, New Iberia, Lafayette area would just have like posted the scores in the window and their record at the time, and especially in 1987 they went on this long winning streak, and they would have like Saints 8 in a row, or Saints beat this team or whatever, and they had like magic numbers and stuff to make the playoffs, which is something that they had never done before. And another very, very distinct memory that I have is my grandfather, who was a lifelong Saints fan. In fact, my grandfather was at the very first Saints game. When John Gilliam returned the kickoff, he said that was like one of the greatest moments of his life. And I can remember him being so beside himself when they made the playoffs for the first time. Now, we're going to talk more about that season and how it ended so abruptly for them in a very, very embarrassing way, to be completely honest. But just that era, a lot of people kind of forget about as far as like the history of the league, as far as like Saints fans themselves. They remember the Drew Brees, Sean Payton era finally, because they won a Super Bowl. But doing that, but you had to have the groundwork. You had to have the foundation for that. And I think the foundation for that franchise was in these 12 seasons from the mid 80s to the mid 1990s that set the foundation for that team, for the franchise, for all of the success that they're going to have from that point forward.
I could agree with that. And then another thing that I vividly remember too, since you mentioned that I was from Baton Rouge, and why it was that important was because back in those days, Baton Rouge, and I think it's still true. I haven't lived there in over 20 years, but since it was outside of the 80-mile radius, technically, if the
Yes.
Saints didn't sell out, they did at home. They didn't come on. They didn't
On
come on
TV.
TV.
They
Whatever.
didn't come on
The game
TV.
was
You're right.
blacked out.
Right.
So as a result, it would always be, we get up Sunday morning, it's like we get the big Sunday Advocate. This is pre-internet, when the paper be full. Yeah, be like, okay, what the Saints playing that today? Because if it's a good game coming on, you're hoping and praying that it's a home game first. And then
Right.
secondly, you're hoping and praying that
They didn't sell out.
that they didn't sell out, because I think we mentioned it a few weeks back, episodes back, what would happen sometimes even if they didn't sell out. No good Hibernia Bank. They've since all merged into Capital One. They bought up all the old banks.
Right.
Hibernia Bank, they'll be like 15,000 short of a sellout. Then Hibernia Bank would purchase all the tickets before the 3 p.m. Friday afternoon cutoff.
Right.
Technically sell the game out, then they come on. And it was nothing worse than, we get home from church, Sunday school, then get there 4:11, watch Mid-South Wrestling, Junkyard Dog.
Yes, it did.
Axel Jim Duncan,
Yeah.
the one-man gang, all of that. The
Yes.
one-man gang, baby, yes, sir. The North American Heavyweight Championship. But anyway, then at 12 would come on the football. 12 would be the football game. And
Yeah.
it would be nothing worse than 12 Central Time. You hear the following voice from Pat Summerall, live from RFK Stadium. We got the 8-1 Cowboys versus the 7-2 Washington Redskins. It's gonna be a barn burner today. And
Yeah.
then John, man, when you see you got that, then you literally see it. Then you literally see the kickoff, and then Danny White trots on the field. Then that screen, they go, live from wherever,
The Superdome.
New Orleans, and you be like, man,
And it'd be like some really,
damn.
it'd be like some really trash game. I mean, not only the Saints were bad, but they were like the team that they were playing were equally bad. Like,
No.
coming from the Superdome, and you have like Vern Lundquist and Terry Bradshaw calling the game, and it's like the New Orleans Saints against the Green Bay Packers, and like, oh my goodness, what are we watching?
You're like,
and then I couldn't turn the game off because my grandfather was a big Saints fan, so I would go in the other room and watch what the NBC game was. It probably was like the Dolphins and Patriots or something, which was a pretty good game in the mid '80s, But but it would be like, okay, I am not watching the Saints. I'm sorry. And for us, that would affect us too. That would actually affect us too because even though we were outside of the 80-mile radius, but it was like, I guess that the affiliate in Lafayette was obligated to put the Saints on because we were kind of like outside the area, but they had so many Saints fans there, but they still, it was just so crazy to like, I wanted to watch the Redskins and Cowboys. Why am I being subjected to this? And that's something that the young kids don't understand. It's like we had to watch the game that was in front of us. We couldn't go to Sunday Ticket or we couldn't go to NFL Red Zone. We had to watch the game that was in front of us, which sucked. You know what I mean? But anyway, enough nostalgia from our childhoods. Let's get down to business.
One more.
Go ahead, baby.
I gotta add right quick, really quick. You said you go over to NBC, right?
Yeah.
Man, because NBC and CBS would alternate the double headers.
Yeah, that's right.
If it's a weekend where CBS has a double header, you take your butt over to NBC. They ain't got nothing but the 3 o'clock game. You stuck like Chuck.
You're stuck. You're stuck.
You're stuck like Chuck. You go over to NBC at 3 o'clock at noon. Man, they got on like Little House on the Prairie reruns, and I'm not talking about the good ones. I'm talking about the ones that
the newer ones
was on when Laura Ingalls was grown and all.
Yeah, the newer ones,
man.
The newer ones, right? You're talking about or the Sunday afternoon matinee brought to you by WVLA television out of Baton Rouge. That's a television affiliate we got. The Baton Rouge NBC station. We play some trash movies in the.
Or even worse, the Andy Griffith reruns, but the ones that went color with blue. You like, if it's in black and white, you got a chance. But man, the ones that were with Goober and color, man, you be like, man, damn, come on, man.
That's it for sure, man.
But
anyway, starting off with the Saints' history, and of course, pre-1985, it was a lot of bad years. The team was founded in November 1st, 1966, All Saints Day, which was one of the reasons for the name being the New Orleans Saints. Founded on All Saints Day, and plus the famous jazz song When the Saints Go Marching In. First game, we mentioned it, very first game in Saints history, 1967, they lost to the Rams 27-13, but it was also famous for John Gilliam's opening kickoff return for a touchdown, which incidentally, the Saints technically it's the second time it's happened. The first time in the NFL, but the second time overall in pro football history has happened because the Miami Dolphins the year before against the Raiders in their very first game, Joe Auer returned the kickoff for a touchdown against the Raiders in the Orange Bowl in their very first game. So the Saints and Dolphins share that common history. The Saints from 1967 through 1984 only had 2 non-losing seasons. Remember, I said that non-losing because both years, 1979 and 1983, they both finished 8-8. Now, the 1983 year is one I distinctly remember because it came down, if you remember, Chuck, it came down to the final game of the regular season against the Rams. And you had Bum Phillips, that was the coach. You had an aging, way past his prime Ken Stabler as the quarterback. You had a really beat up Earl Campbell running the football, but hey, they still had a chance. But 2 interceptions and then a last second Rams field goal from 43 yards out, ended the Saints' dreams of a playoff berth in 1983. Prior to that, the greatest moment in Saints history, obviously, was the Tom Dempsey field goal. the 63-yard field goal at Tulane Stadium against the Lions in 1970, which is still top 5 greatest moments in Saints history. You agree with that?
You know how bad you got to be for a damn kick to still be top 5 in your franchise history 60 years later. You know how bad you got to be. But yes,
Exactly.
I do agree with that. And I mean, the Saints had, he was no longer the snake Kenny Stabler. He was just plain old Kenneth Stabler by
Right.
then, man. He just done. But yeah, they were they were pretty bad. Not a lot of just a lot of doom and gloom. And it just, and to your point, it seemed like they would always try to um get players who were aged and past their best. Because you remember they had Hank Stram as the coach.
Yeah, yeah, during that era. Yeah, Hank
And
Stram
things
coached for a while. Right.
correct, and things like that. And then pretty much looking at it now as a grown up, the Saints were kind of like the team where your best days are past you. They come calling up. That's the last check you get. Once you can't make their roster anymore, you have to leave at that
Right.
point. And they were just bad. They were bad.
Speaking of bad, I think that the most recognizable symbol of that era was the paper bags on people's heads going to the Superdome. That was started by Buddy D. Remember? Buddy Diliberto. I can never pronounce that man's name right. But anyway, Buddy D was the sports talk show host in New Orleans. And he came up with the idea of people going to the Superdome with bags on their heads so they wouldn't be identified as Saints fans or Saints season ticket holders. So that was pretty much the long-term symbol of that era of the Saints. But they still had decent players, I guess. You had the Thunder and Lightning backfield of Chuck Muncie and Tony Galbraith, and of course you had the quarterback Archie Manning. And I saw this stat, and matter of fact, somebody had brought this up, and I don't have the actual numbers with me, but do you realize that when Archie Manning left, which I think was after the 1981 season, he left and played a few more years. He played 2 years, I believe, with the Oilers and then 1 year with the Vikings. Do you realize that he went winless? He did not win a game. From after he left the Saints, he never won a start. Never. Every start he had, he lost. Now, granted, the Oilers in the early 80s was god-awful. I don't think 1 year, and I think in 83, they went something like the year before Warren Moon got there. I think they went something like 2-14 or something like that. And the Vikings were like in between, going between Wade Wilson and an aging Tommy Kramer, and Archie Manning would come in and spot duty and just he was not. I mean, I've always heard this comparison to when people talk about Archie Manning is that he was the best of the worst quarterbacks, but the worst of the best quarterbacks. That's the best way to describe Archie Manning. He was always in that no man's land. Now, when he was at Ole Miss, I saw film of him when he was at Ole Miss that he was incredible at Ole Miss. But when he went to the Saints and he made that fatal mistake of winning that very first game on the last second play, that gave a lot of fans hope. But then that hope was certainly dashed when reality set in.
Correct. And I'm glad you brought that up because the Saints were god awful. And I'm also glad you brought that up because you got to echo my sentiments in a way. Now, you know me, I can be a bit harsh. I can be an a-hole at times, but
you said that, not me.
They've always had this misnomer regarding Archie that he was good, but the rest of the Saints were trash, and he was just in an unfortunate situation. And to the nuance you added, that could be somewhat true, but I've seen some of the films. Guess what? He was a scrub too. He wasn't that good either. He was a scrub too because they just try to make it seem like Archie was this great quarterback, and then the Saints, unfortunately, he was befallen with the fate of going to the New Orleans Saints, which derailed the potential perennial All Pro and potential Hall of Fame season, right? Whereas I think to your point, he was all right, but he wasn't all that good either. And then we see it playing out today because I'm not to be a hole, but his son, I mean his grandson Arch, looked like he got some of that Archie blood in him, Arch man, and he ain't got no Peyton or Eli. Well, Eli wasn't that good either. He's gonna make the Hall of Fame, but because he's a Manning, but that's another topic for another day. And I just
Well,
think that sometimes he was
yeah.
overblown in terms of how good he was.
Well, you got to take into consideration also we're recording this the day after the Longhorns lost of all teams to Florida, which have been struggling big time this whole season until the Saturday before we record this, beating the aforementioned Arch Manning and the Texas Longhorns. Now, starting in 1985, once again, change was on the horizon for the Saints. Tom Benson is now has bought the team, has become the new owner of the Saints, a car salesman from San Antonio, Texas, purchases the team, and one of the first things he does is hires a general manager named Jim Finks. Now, Jim Finks, up to this point of his career, has done some things. Okay, and this was basically a home run for the Saints. At least on paper, it seemed like it was. Chuck, we were talking before we started about Jim Finks and all of the contributions that he did. Now, what was some of the things that you were telling me? I want you to tell the audience what you were telling me before we came on, for this episode.
In preparation for the show, I knew that Jim Finks was a great general manager, but I just I knew about that exclusively within the context of his Saints tenure. I had no idea that prior to that he arguably had a Hall of Fame career prior to arriving to the Saints. Like for example, he played like 6 seasons in the league at DB and QB for the Steelers, which is relevant to his effectiveness as an executive. But then he was he played and coached for the Calgary Stampeders of the Canadian Football League, became GM in 1957. They were the winningest team of the CFL in the 1960s, and under with the groundwork that he laid, they finally won the Grey Cup in 71. And then I also had no idea that he was the architect of the Purple People Eaters in Minnesota. I had no idea that he had attained great players such as Jim Marshall, Carl Eller, Gary Larson, and then of course Alan Page, who was a dog. Then he hired Bud Grant. He had traded Fran Tarkenton, but reacquired Fran Tarkenton from the Giants in 72. And then in addition to that, that's enough as is that he was GM of the Bears, and he, ironically, because this guy, Mike Ditka, would go on to become Saints coach after Mora. He left in 82 because Hallis did not consult him on the hiring of Ditka to do head coach for the Bears. But however, he stayed on through the 83 draft. And then, as you know, in 84, they went toe-to-toe with the Niners in Candlestick. And then in 85, one of the most famous teams of all time, perhaps one of the most dominant teams of all time, the 85 Bears, in which the origin of many of those players is attributed to Jim Finks. And it's just, I had no idea in my research of him that he had, as you said, he had done some things. I'd like to clarify and say that he had done some things. So
that's right.
For real, I had no idea that he had had all of that success. And I mean, of things that are not just success, but Purple People Leaders. When you talk about the great defenses, you talk about them, great coaches, Bud Grant, great quarterbacks, Fran Tarkenton.
Right.
You know what I mean? And he was instrumental in all of that, which is crazy. I had no idea.
Well, when you talk about Jim Finks and his Canadian ties, you also got to consider that you had mentioned Bud Grant. Bud Grant had won a couple of Grey Cups as a coach in Winnipeg during the mid-1960s, and he also got from the Canadian Football League Joe Kapp, who was a all-star quarterback with the BC Lions in the early 60s, and they won a Grey Cup in the early 1960s. I want to say they won the 63 Grey Cup with Joe Cap, and Joe Cap led the Vikings to Super Bowl IV, and arguably could have been MVP of the 1969 season if it wasn't for the great season that Roman Gabriel had with the Rams. But they hired Jim Finks, and you went over all of my notes. He put together the Vikings teams from the 60s. He was in charge of the Bears' dominant defense of the mid-1980s, And then on January 14th, 1986, he's hired by the Saints. And one of the first things the Saints does is hire a coach from the now defunct USFL, who won 2 championships with the USFL. He hires Jim Mora, and one of the first moves he makes as head and general manager after getting Mora is getting a quarterback from who is playing for another USFL team with the Oakland Invaders, the final year of their season, Bobby Hebert.
Correct. Got Bobby Hebert, and then he had Jim Mora, the Philadelphia/Baltimore Stars, who made all 3 USFL championship games. And then, ironically, he won 2 of those 3. The one that he lost, Bobby Hebert, the Michigan Panthers. And I remember the lethal combination in the USFL, because we used to watch the USFL. The lethal combination of Bobby Hebert and Anthony Carter, who would go on and star with the Minnesota Vikings. And he was a very good player for many years in the NFL as well. But they used to wreak havoc in the USFL. So that was just kind of crazy how they kind of put all of that together. And then, then obviously not trying to get ahead of ourselves too much, but between he and Mora, they kind of used a lot of their USFL ties to their full advantage.
Yeah, and let's quickly talk about some of the players. We're talking about Bobby Hebert, right quick. And let's talk about him for a sec. During his Saint tenure, he was there at 75 starts. He had a record of 49-26. Passed for 14,630 yards passing, 85 touchdowns against 75 picks, and had a quarterback passer rating of 79.1. I remember Bobby Hebert having the perfect combination of a strong arm, but he's also tremendously accurate, especially for someone during the mid 80s, he could, in my opinion, I think Bobby Hebert with his skill probably could play right now, if he could play right now in the type of era that we have in the NFL.
Absolutely, the old Cajun cannon. He absolutely could play now when you got guys running around like Dylan Gabriel and I mean they had to bring an ancient Joe Flacco off the couch late last year just to win a couple of ball games. He without question, especially with his strong arm you mentioned and his aggressive style, it would be perfectly suited for today's game. And he kind of was borderline a gunslinger, not quite as much, didn't take quite as many chances as people like Brett Favre did, but he was a very, very good quarterback. And and I'm sure since we're talking about him, we might get to this, but I'll bring it up now. He had a lot of success with the Saints, and then he kind of is a mixed bag in terms of his history with the Saints, because right at the peak of their team, the Saints didn't want to give him his money, and so he wound up sitting out the entire season for 1990, and that's when they were really kind of, would you say they were Super Bowl contenders, or I would say they were dark horse contenders, because you said Skins, Giants, Niners, kind of the class at that time with the Cowboys emerging.
Yeah, I mean, the Saints at that time were the dark horse team. They were one of those teams that you could possibly see getting on a run. And I wanted to kind of mention this quickly. about the defense, okay, which, as you know, a team could get on a roll during the playoffs with a solid defense. And the Saints defense was by far one of the most incredible defenses in the NFL, maybe in the history of the NFL for sure, during the decade of the 1980s. Nicknamed the Dome Patrol, you had the likes of Ricky Jackson, Hall of Famer, Sam Mills, Hall of Famer, Vaughn Johnson, and Pat Swilling. In fact, one year, 1991, all four of those players made the Pro Bowl. So that is something that no other team has ever done, to send up their four starting linebackers intact to the Pro Bowl.
Yes, I mean it was just a tremendous run, tremendous players, and we kind of in our last aired episode regarding the Panthers and the Jaguars, we spoke at length about Sam Mills, so pretty much no need to kind of rehash all of that again. But
Right.
his name speaks for himself, and then Ricky Jackson, it was just a dog, drafted in 81, all rookie team in 81, six-time Pro Bowler, four-time first team All Pro, and voted second team All Pro twice with the Saints. Because,
Right.
like a lot of times, they kind of have this tendency in terms of individual accolades in sports, period, but more so in football than any other sport, that you have to do it for a winning club. And for a lot of those years, the Saints were just abysmal, and he was still able to accomplish those things. And then, as you mentioned before, um, and I mentioned briefly, the utilizing the USFL ties, the aforementioned Sam Mills, of course, brought in Vaughn Johnson, and just four-time Pro Bowler, member of the Saints Hall of Fame and Louisiana Sports Hall of Fame. And then Finks and Moore drafted Pat Swilling, 86 draft out of Georgia Tech, you
Yeah.
know, five-time Pro Bowler and 1991 AP Defensive Player of the Year. So they just, and along with players like Bobby Hebert, guys like, they had Eric Martin, they drafted Dalton Hilliard and Reuben Mays. It's just
Yeah.
like they just, for the first time, they were just making home runs, not necessarily with guys that were like flashy, all glitz and glamour picks, but they did a great job of picking guys that would fit well into the newly established team culture, which was desperately needed with the Saints, because as I mentioned before, they were the worst, arguably the worst run organization in professional sports. But then also guys that could fit their roles to do what they aspire to do on both sides of the ball.
All right. Well, look, Chuck, we're going to take a little quick short break, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk more about the seasons at hand, the seasons in general of the Saints, the way the Saints success, the newfound success that they had never experienced. You're listening to the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, a member of the Sports History Network. And we're back right here. You're listening to the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. Dana Augusta, along with Charles Combs, bringing you the 1980s, late 90s, or what we would consider the Jim Mora era New Orleans Saints. And before we get into the seasons, Chuck had brought up something, also right before we started recording, and that is the draft of 1986 for the New Orleans Saints. And as you were telling me, Chuck, there was some really, really interesting and really incredible players that will make contributions for the Saints. During this era of this team. Just go ahead and talk to us about that.
Okay, well, a lot of times, when you're trying to turn something around and kind of get on the winning side of things, you need a lot of luck, but especially but you need to really hit on the draft a lot, and especially when you're a small market team like the Saints, that is essential because like a lot of times you don't have the funds to lure in free agents, especially at this time when there was no hard cap. So,
Right.
any player that was decent was going to the contenders, i.e., Giants, Saints, Skins, Bears, etc. So 1986 draft, they had let's see, one, two, three, four, five picks in the first 62, and they just hit a home run with every last one of them. First round overall, Jim Dombrowski,
Oh
offensive
man,
tackle
yeah.
out of Virginia. He was a really solid and steady contributor and a leader for many years on that old line and in the locker room. Then pick 231 overall, the dog, Dalton Hilliard, man, just a
Yeah.
dog out of LSU. Hilliard and James Gang, Bill Lonsberger,
Yeah.
LSU, Dalton Hilliard and Gary James. And then, to the little brother Mark, he talking about he was from Patterson. That's Dalton Hilliard territory, man. You should
Yeah.
know better than to go along with the Bucks, man. But that's okay. Then pick number three, 57 overall, selected another running back out of Washington State who gave him a lot of good production for years, and Reuben Mays. He was very good back and gave him a lot of help in
Now,
terms of
now in the case of Reuben Mays, not to cut you off, Chuck, but in the
yeah,
case
yes,
of
sir.
Reuben Mays, I have to mention this. Reuben Mays, according to Pro Football Reference, is the most successful Canadian-born player in the history of the National Football League. He's from North Battlefield, Saskatchewan, and he was a running back for the New Orleans Saints. And I tell you, he was a power running back. They had their own version of Thunder and Lightning, seriously, because he was the offensive rookie of the year in 1986, and he made the Pro Bowl in the 86-87 season. But Reuben Mays, and be completely honest, was one of my all-time favorite players growing up. I loved Reuben Mays, and I think maybe because he's Canadian, I don't know, but according to NFL Reference, the most successful Canadian-born skilled player in the history of the National Football League.
That is what's up. And like usual, in my introductory episode, I love conversing with you. You always learn something new. I had no clue of that, so definitely appreciate that tidbit. Um, Then just think about this. The next pick in third round, 60th overall, the aforementioned Pat Swilling, linebacker out of
Yes.
Georgia Tech. And then even two picks later in the third round, drafted another running back out of Virginia by the name of Barry Word, who was really good.
Yeah.
But this speaks to how well that they built the new culture and engineered the roster. It was so deep with like Hilliard, Reuben Mays. Let's not forget my main man, Buford Jordan,
For
baby.
Jordan, right?
Yeah, Buford Jordan was a dog. He could block it, catch it, run it, do everything. They had so much depth that despite Barry Word's ability, he really didn't have no room. Then you remember they shipped him out to Kansas City, where Nigerian Nightmare Christian Okoye, and even the LSU alum Harvey Williams had a lot of
Right.
successful years over there with the Kansas City Chiefs.
Right, and that was those Chiefs teams, with Barry Word, and you brought up some names that I had kind of forgotten about. Of course you can't forget about the Nigerian Nightmare, obviously, but Barry Word and Harvey, those are some really underrated backs that a lot of people kind of forgot about, over the years. 1986, you had the 1986 going into 1987. Okay, 86, they went 7-9. They were coming off of a 5-11 season. They went 7-9 and improved by 2 games. But the 1987 season was interesting for one other tidbit is the fact that it was a strike-shortened season of 1987. They played instead of the usual 16 games back then, they played 15. And they had replacement games for 3 of those. Now, when the strike hit, the Saints were 2-1. I'm sorry, the Saints were 3-2 when the strike hit. And doing a little bit of irony here, the Saints went 2-1 in those replacement games in 1987. One of those wins was against the Chicago Bears. You may know this. One of those games was against the Chicago Bears. Do you know who the starting quarterback was for the Chicago Bears during one of those replacement games?
Sean Payton.
Sean Payton. Which
Yes,
that's how sports at times, and that's one of the reasons why I love sports, because sometimes you have instances where paths cross, and then a few years later they cross again in a different way. But 1987, they come back from the strike. They lose to the 49ers in a very close 24-22 game in the Superdome. Then they would embark on the franchise's, at that time, longest winning streak by winning 9 straight games to finish 12-3, including a win at Candlestick Park against the 49ers, Joe Montana, Jerry Rice, that crew. They finished 12-3, but they finished a game behind the 49ers.
I hate to cut you off, but let me get in here for just a split second, if you
Go
don't
ahead.
mind.
Go ahead.
Sorry. A key catalyst. Speaking of Jim Mora, as well as the 49ers. Another thing that's always remembered about Jim Mora is his tirades, his post-game tirades, and emotional outbursts. And the first of which in his Saints tenure occurred following that 49er game, the Week 16 loss that you referred to. They lost 24-22, and Morton Anderson, who was the highest paid player on the team at the time, great kicker. I think he's Hall of Fame. I'm not sure. I think he is. But he missed the last second field goal, and then after that, he launched the famous woulda, coulda, shoulda speech. At the first of his famous tirade. And he was like, coulda, woulda, shoulda. It's the difference I'm talking about. The good teams don't come in and say coulda. They get it done, all right? It's simple. I'm tired of saying woulda, coulda, shoulda. That's why we ain't good enough yet, because we're saying coulda, and they ain't. I'm pissed off right now. You can bet your ass I am. I'm sick of woulda, coulda, shoulda coming close, if only. And then that tirade, the Saints would run across 9 straight wins, including the win at Candlestick to close out the season.
Exactly. And one of the games I mostly remember from that 1987 season was November 29th at Pittsburgh. It came down to a goal line stand against the Steelers. And this was so important because with their win, 20-16 win at Three River Stadium on that hard AstroTurf, they improved their record to 8-3, but that guaranteed them not only a playoff berth, but their very first winning season. And I remember that day. It was a cloudy, rainy day in Louisiana that afternoon. 1987. I was a freshman in high school, and it was just a dreary day in Louisiana. And I tell you what, everybody on my block that was a Saints fan, you swore they won the Super Bowl. They just finished with a winning season. Something with some cases for some teams, that's like, okay, duh, we got a winning season, no big deal. But this was the Saints we're talking about, and they ended up finishing, they ended up winning that game and guaranteed a winning season and a playoff spot. That was huge. Okay. Few weeks later, they finally get to the playoffs, and they're in the playoffs for the first time, and a home game nonetheless against the Minnesota Vikings. You knew it was a big game because the aforementioned Pat Summerall and John Madden was calling the game. And this was huge, okay? And what happened? Oh my God, what happened?
The clock struck midnight, baby.
There are teams that have like a big, huge, it's like you're waiting for this to finally happen, and it's finally happened. And the worst thing in the world happened was you lay an egg. Well, the Saints laid a huge egg on this afternoon. Ended up losing 44 to 10 at home to the Minnesota Vikings. Now, granted, the Minnesota Vikings would end up one play away from the Super Bowl that year as Darren Nelson dropped a short touchdown pass on the final seconds against the Redskins in the NFC Championship game that year, the week after blowing out the 49ers at Candlestick. But the Saints in this game, 4 turnovers, just 149 yards from scrimmage. Anthony Carter had a punt return for a touchdown, and one of the things I mostly remember about that game was the Hassan Jones Hail Mary at the end of the first half, which should not have even happened because the Saints was called for offsides the play before, which resulted in an untimed down. So the Vikings had another chance, and Hassan Jones came up with the touchdown at the end of the game. And then from that point, my grandfather just turned the game off. See, I'm done with this. you
Yeah.
know, I remember that day like it was yesterday. How bad the Saints looked in that game.
Yes, and it was just so disheartening because their formula all year was just timely passing, solid running game, relied on their defense, not making a lot of mental mistakes, not making a lot of turnovers and things like that. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the clock struck midnight. It's like they turned into a pumpkin again, man. And it's like
Exactly.
the same old Saints, just things that seemingly only the Saints do. It's just making, 4 turnovers. Punt return for a touchdown. Because usually it's like, what are the percentages? If you win the giveaway takeaway ratio by at least one, your winning percentage is like 60%. If you win it by at least two, it's more like 75%. If you have a non-offensive touchdown in any way, your winning percentage is 80%. And it's like they had 4 turnovers. They had the punt return by the aforementioned Anthony Carter for a touchdown. And it's like then basically the Hail Mary, that's almost like a non-offensive touchdown because you're literally just throwing the ball up. It's like it's just impossible to win a game like that. And they really laid an egg, and which was disappointing. But and you look at it that year, you look at it like you mentioned a Darren Nelson drop. It depends on how you look at it because up here, I live in the DC area. This is Redskin / Commander country. To this day, they swear that Darryl Green, the great Darryl Green, that is,
Yes.
broke the play up. So it depends on your perspective, but I tend to agree with you
Right.
that it was right there. Then that was the year Doug Williams beat the Broncos in the Super Bowl, and you think
Yeah.
to your point that the Vikings went all the way there. Unlike most years in which the NFC champion was always like some sort of juggernaut most of the time, that
Right.
was the one year where it was kind of like an open,
Yeah,
it was anybody's ball game,
yeah,
you know?
absolutely. You know, I remember that year, and it was like such of a new thing. It was like surreal almost. Um, in fact, the next year, 1988, the very first, I remember watching the NFL Today on CBS with Brent Musburger and Irv Cross and Dick Butkus and all of them. Dick Butkus actually said, and I'll never forget this, that for Super Bowl 23, which was in Miami at the end of that year, he predicted the Super Bowl in his words, he thought the Super Bowl was going to be the Saints versus Oilers in the Super Bowl. I had never heard that anybody in their right mind on national television actually say he thinks the New Orleans Saints are going to go to the Super Bowl. I was floored by that. Okay. But in 88, they fell kind of back to earth, I kind of think. Let's see, 1988, they lost 5 of their last 7 games. Okay, they went on a 7 game winning streak to start the year, but they lost 5 out of 7 and ended up missing out on the playoffs. But one of the games that I remember from the 1988 season was the Broncos came to New Orleans and played the Saints. That was the first time the Broncos were in the Superdome to play a regular season game. Well, the first time they played a game ever since they got blasted by Dallas in Super Bowl 12 and ended up getting blasted in this game 42-0. And that was the Broncos' first game in the Superdome since Super Bowl 12. I thought that was kind of interesting. And also that year in week 8, they beat the Raiders 20-6 for the first time in the history of the franchise. So you had two instances in 1988, which was kind of headline making for the Saints, despite them missing the playoffs.
Yes, and they were very good that year, like the first half of the season, and then it just seems like they just couldn't win close games, because you look here, they lost to the Rams 10-12. They lost to the Skins 27-24 in RFK. So to go to RFK and play the Skins on even footing in those days, you had to have a pretty solid ball club and able to
Yeah.
do that, to be able to do that. They lost to the Giants. I think, wasn't this the 12-13? Wasn't that the Lawrence Taylor game when he got hurt and separated his
Yes,
shoulder
that's right.
on
That's
Sunday
right.
Night Football with Mike
Yes.
Patrick, and then he just came in and not to talk about him because he said this himself, shoulder injury, on crack, drunk, all
Yeah.
of that, and nobody still can block him. That
Yeah.
just shows you how great he was. And then it's just like they lost a series of heartbreaking close games that, even if a couple of these go their way, they finished 10-6 despite that. So
Yeah.
a couple of these go your way, you're 12-4, possibly home field advantage throughout the playoffs, possibly, even though I say possibly because that's when the Niners had Taylor at his peak. Jerry Rice had the Jerry curl flat top then, man.
Yeah.
That's when he was just,
That's when he was.
he was always great, but now he was at the peak of his powers.
That was
At
that
that
was
time.
like what you said. That was like Michael Jordan with hair.
Yeah.
That's pretty much the same in the same category.
Yeah, at the peak of his powers, that would have been tough.
1989. Once again they missed the playoffs in '89. They finished 9-7, which was their second winning season in franchise history, but they missed the playoffs by 2 games. Also, what was notable about that season, they shut out the Cowboys 28-0. What was so notable about that game, that was the first game in Cowboy history without Tom Landry on the sidelines. That was the first Jimmy Johnson, Jerry Jones Cowboy team with rookie Troy Aikman, and they got smacked by the Cowboys 28-0. And I remember watching this and thinking to myself, I've never seen the Cowboys look this bad. Little do we know, 4 years later, they're running roughshod through the NFL. Also that year, Dalton Hilliard, which had his best pro career up to this point, led the NFL with 19 rushing touchdowns and his first 1,000 yards rushing season. He finished with 1,262 yards rushing. So you had a offensive rookie of the year a couple of years earlier with Reuben Mays, and then you have Dalton Hilliard, 1,000-yard rusher. You have a really, really good 1-2 punch in the backfield with the Saints doing this time.
Yeah, and it's just like it's so disheartening because it seems like the defense and that don't patrol that we aforementioned, they were always steady, and then they kind of wasting all of these big time individual efforts on the offensive side of the ball. And it's like
Yeah.
they just could not punch through. It just seems like every time they just could not punch through, especially the 49er game in New Orleans. Every year, it's like they would have them on the ropes. This year, no exception. They lost 20-24. If I remember correctly, that was the game in which they missed a clear safety when they sacked Joe Montana. He was a clear safety, and they
Right.
didn't call him. They ruled that forward progress. He had broken. He had broken
I
the
remember that, right.
you know it's like they lost that 24-20, and then it's just like they just could not at those big moments. They just, even though they were much improved, it seemed like they just could not get through that. They lost to the Skins 16-14 at home, and it's like, okay, they started out 1-4. That was loss number 3, loss number 4. It's like you're right there, but you can't win. You can't close out. You can't close out ball games, and for some reason, and they just, as we've always suspected, they were just kind of in some ways, just snake bit. They were 9-7, outscored their opposition by 85 points, which is a lot for the Saints, and they closed the year with a 3-game winning streak. But it was just that 1-4 start was just a bit too much to overcome.
Right. Moving on to 1990, and this was kind of a pivotal year for this franchise. First off, they were missing Bobby Hebert for the whole season because of a contract dispute. In his place was a pair of quarterbacks. You had Steve Walsh and John Fourcade. Now, John Fourcade is very interesting. To me, he's always been interesting because he was a quarterback that was on the replacement roster that stuck around with the team. He was Hebert's backup for most of during that time, but he was more mobile. He didn't have as strong an arm as Hebert, nor was he accurate, but he was fun to watch, as a quarterback. And I think he kind of reminds you of basically an 80s version of Taysom Hill in that he could run with the ball just as well as he could throw it. But the problem with him was that he was just so inconsistent and so erratic, that one game he could come in and you could swear he could throw for 300-400 yards. So the next game, he's like overshooting everybody. So it was like wildly inconsistent. But the person getting most of the stars in Hebert's absence was Steve Walsh from the University of Miami. And Chuck, I'm going to say this, and maybe I could say this now being so far upriver in time is concerned. This was my senior year of high school, 1990. I swore that I had a stronger arm than Steve Walsh. His big thing was that his lack of arm strength, and it was evident because I had a stronger arm than he did, and he was a very brainy, very smart quarterback, especially when he was at the University of Miami. But when he came to the NFL, not so much. But the Saints, to their credit, after a slow 2-5 start, they avoided a losing finish and finished 8-8. But the division was so weak in 1990, they actually made the playoffs. Above all odds, they make the playoffs for the second time in 1990.
Yes, they make this playoff for the second time in 1990, but it was some pivotal things that occurred in that year that would kind of spell disaster for the Saints coming up. Because like briefly, let's talk about John Fourcade. Now don't sell yourself short, brother, because you and I used to play catch with the baseball in the backyard, man. My father used to say, "Boy, that dude," he said, "You were the only guy he ever saw that had a stronger arm than I had in terms of throwing the baseball, and you could chuck it. So you could probably outthrow most people." But nonetheless, John Fourcade, he was a guy that we used to refer to, at least down south. He had what we used to call a pop gun arm.
Yeah.
You remember used to make them those things with them papers.
Yeah.
Fold it in some way and you can make it pop.
Yeah.
It pop, but it really ain't nothing to it. But then,
right.
In addition to that, speaking of Steve Walsh, in order to acquire him, the Saints traded away draft picks of the first 3 rounds in the following 1991 draft, first, second, and third round picks to get Steve Walsh. So not only could he not deliver the goods, but they kind of basically threw away essential draft capital that would kind of help prolong that Mora era, kind of help reinforce get some players in there to kind of reinforce some of those losses, like players leaving, players aging, things like that. And then Steve Walsh was a bum because I brought this up before. I'm kind of an avid Tecmo Super Bowler
Yeah.
on Nintendo Entertainment System. Whenever I use the Saints for my team for the season, I immediately bench Steve Walsh in favor of John Forcade. I don't even bother to play because
There's no second guessing on your part.
no, he's not Steve Grogan. He's not Steve Grogan, Jack Trudeau bad, but he's up there with him.
Wow. That's an indictment on somebody, I'll tell you that. That year, the Saints, that year, 1990, they go to the playoffs and they play the Chicago Bears. First road playoff game in franchise history. And it wasn't as bad as a lot of people thought it was going to be. The Saints playing outside in the cold in Chicago at Soldier Field, January 6, 1991. The temperature at kickoff was 16 degrees, and they lose. The Saints were held to only 193 total yards, 63 yards rushing, only 6 offensive first downs in that game. Steve Walsh was knocked out of the game. John Forcade came in, tried to have a little bit of a rally in the second half. And to be completely honest with you, Chuck, is one of those games that you watch that you remember it, but you really don't remember it,
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that's what it was. I remember watching it again. I was a senior in high school. I probably had a lot of other things going on other than that, but I was a big sports fan, of course, back then. But I remember watching this game, but I don't remember much about it. I went back and watched it in preparation for this, and I'm like, okay, I remember the game, but I don't remember anything from it. That's how. And it wasn't really a dominating performance by the Bears either. They were going to lose the next week to the Super Bowl bound New York Giants. And then the Giants ended up beating Buffalo in one of the best Super Bowls ever played. But that was the game that where we saw the emergence of Jeff Hostetler. But this game here, the Saints against the Bears, again, I remember it, but I don't remember it.
Well, it was one of those things where I vaguely remember the game as well because, unlike you, I need to get better about going back and rewatching things. A lot of times I rely on my rote memory, and I remember, ironically, the Saints kind of as they were constructed in some ways, especially on the defensive side of the ball, they were kind of built to kind of play in those sort of conditions. But unbelievably, 16 degrees is warm in Chicago that time of year, unbelievably.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, like you mentioned, to the Bears' effort, even though it was 16-6, the score wasn't lopsided. It just seems like the Saints were never really in the game. And then I also think that the Bears probably played in a way where they knew that with Steve Walsh or John Forcade at the helm, the only way they could lose the game was if they lost the game themselves. So with them at the helm, just try to not make the big mistake, the big turnover, and against their defense, even though the defense had aged significantly from their heyday way back in the mid '80s. Because now you're talking about Peyton was gone, not talking about the defense, but Neil Anderson was there in place of Peyton. Then, you had guys like Trace Armstrong that were there on the D line. He was a good player, people like that. The only way you could lose was if you beat yourself because, Steve Walsh nor John Forcade could beat you.
Right. Moving on to 1991. Now, this one is like the absolute apex of the Jim Mora era was the 1991 season. My freshman year at Southern University. The Saints started off 7-0. No one had even remotely thought about this. Hebert was back. They start off 7-0. They lost their first game to the Bears, which is kind of a bookmark for me because that was the last time I ever bet on a game. like for money, and I lost because I bet the Saints to win straight up, and they got crushed by the Bears in the Superdome. But anyway, the Saints ended up finishing that year. They started off 7-0. They started off, just won the final two games to claim the first division title in Saints history, that year. The 49ers, to show you how much of an inverse 1991 was, the 49ers, the Giants, and the Rams were all out of the playoffs. But the Lions, Falcons, and Saints were in the playoffs. So that was kind of like, okay, this is weird. Okay. 49ers missed the playoff. They were 10-6, but they missed the playoff. The Rams that year fell to 3-13, one of the biggest drops in NFL history. They move on to the playoffs, and waiting for them in the playoffs, the aforementioned, and I would love to do a podcast on this episode or on this team, the 1991, quote unquote, too legit to quit Atlanta Falcons. That team was so full of swagger and so full of themselves that I think it was just is an interesting notation. But this game here, of all the Saints playoff games during this point, this one they literally had a legitimate shot to win.
Correct. And it's like the too legit to quit Falcons, man. They had, who was it? Did they had Chris Miller at quarterback.
Chris Miller was the quarterback.
Was Mike Rozier the running back then?
No, it was Pritchard.
Ooh, man. And then I had Tim McKay.
Tim McKay was on that team. Deion Sanders, Andre Rison, Michael Haynes, and I was like, and Jesse Tuggle, one of the most underrated linebackers ever. Yeah,
very good player. Very good player.
Yes. And they end up losing that game 27-20. The Saints had like a 20-6, had like a decent lead on this, at a pretty decent lead. 1991, they lose. That's the only time the Saints and Falcons have ever met in the postseason. To say that they're rivals, that's the only time. They led the NFL in fewest points that year in 1991, but they just fell apart in the fourth quarter. The key play in that game was a 60-yard touchdown pass from Chris Miller to Michael Haynes to pretty much give them the lead, which they never relinquished, So this was, again, Saints in the playoffs, had a decent chance to win this time, but for whatever reason, they fell apart, and then Chris Miller to Michael Haynes pretty much ended it.
Yeah, and they just always, when they go bad, they'll quit on you in a minute, man. They'll quit on you in a minute, man. And they just kind of let go of the rope a little bit in that game. And it's kind of weird that with their defense, we're going through their seasons, and then we're seeing like a troubling trend as we go through the years that they, for the most part, they start out flying on fire, and then the back half of the season come, they begin to fade a little bit. And just a question for you, and I know it's hard because we don't know the exact context, but do you think it was kind of like perhaps a lack of depth, or as the season goes on, as teams get more and more tape, they know how to attack you, they know how to exploit you, or they know how to kind of shut you down? You think it was a combination of all those things, or with Jim Mora, because he seemed like he was very boisterous in press conferences, so it's hard to say what he was like in the locker room. Was he one of those guys a la Bill Fitch in the NBA that kind of, as the season go on, by November, you just like, man, just shut up. I'm tired of hearing your mouth. I think it might be,
Chuck, I think it might be a combination of those things. It might be a combination of them, the teams that they're playing, getting tape on them. Because if you notice, again, like what you said, they start off great, and then they go through like a midseason swoon, and then they realize they're behind the eight ball, and they become a little bit more daring offensively or defensively, whichever the case may be, and would essentially pick it up toward the latter part of the year to get back in the race and eventually make the playoffs, or just come close to making the playoffs, or in this case, win the division. and then by the time you get to the playoffs and things like that, but like that, they're pretty much spent. You know,
Shot they low.
Exactly. I think they just pretty much did this very. That's what happened to them, especially in this 91 season, starting off 7-0, starting off with this incredible run, to get started. They go through a midseason swoon. They have to pick it up at the end of the year. And then once they picked it up at the end of the year, they play against the Atlanta Falcons, a team that they had really had dead to rights in that game and ended up losing, in the last quarter, last half of the last quarter with a Chris Miller to Michael Haynes touchdown pass. So, they kind of gave up the rope then, and that was a troubling theme heading into the 1992 season once again. But we're going to take another quick break, and we'll come back to finish up the show. Right after this short commercial break, you're listening to the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. Keep it right here on the Sports History Network. And we're back here on the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. I'm Dana Augusta and Charles Combs joining you live and direct on this Sunday evening here. And we're talking about the New Orleans Saints, the Jim Mora era of the Saints. And we're going to finish off talking about that. And then later on, we'll discuss the Who Dat Chant and the cultural significance of that chant here in South Louisiana, and to put to bed for once and for all which came first, Who Dat in New Orleans or Who Dey in Cincinnati. And the answer might surprise you. Now, moving on to the 1992 season, and the 92, the New Orleans Saints coming off of their shocking loss to the Falcons in the playoffs the year before, they had another great season. They go 12-4 on the year, but unfortunately they were swept by the 14-2 San Francisco 49ers, finishing 2 games behind the Niners in the NFC West back then. But their record was good enough to not have another home playoff game, this time against the Randall Cunningham-led Philadelphia Eagles. Now, from that season, Chuck, what do you remember from the 92 season which comes to mind?
Oh man, I just remember that, just the, kind of like seems like everything had gone right, that they were playing well and all of that, and then they just couldn't. Bobby Hebert was hitting on all cylinders. Eric Martin, guys like that. The defense was playing really well, and then they just, as usual, they just could not. It was just weird. They would beat the Niners in Candlestick, but that home game against the Niners, it just always ended really close in controversy, leaving plays on the field, and they just
Right.
and I just remember that they were really good, and that it was a chance to thought they were going to go really, really far, even though the Niners finished 14-2. They outscored the opposition by 128 points, which is a significant margin of victory in the pro ranks. And
Yeah.
they just, as usual, they just fizzle out at the worst popular time. It's just like possible time, rather. And they were up. They were in the game. They were up, and then just the Eagles go off for 26 in the fourth quarter, and it's just like, what the hell happened?
The Eagles that year finished 11-5, one game behind the finished actually tied with 2 games behind the Dallas Cowboys in that juggernaut gauntlet known as the NFC East at that time. Um, but I felt like going into that game, for what I remember, this was like the window was really starting to close on this team. Like, if you're going to do it, this is the year to do it. Now, would they beat the 49ers in the playoffs or the up and coming the Dallas Cowboys who had arrived by this point? Were they good enough to beat them? Probably not. But their window of opportunity was pretty much closed by this point. They were 0-3 in the postseason, and a lot of people were just saying, can we just win a playoff game now? And as you mentioned, in that playoff game against the Philadelphia Eagles, they get off to this great lead. They go up 17-7. And finally you're thinking, okay, this may be the time. This may be it, But as the year before, blowing a lead in the playoffs, the Saints do it again. This time they have a 10-point lead and they blow it. They ended up losing the final score 36-20. They could not, from what I remember that game, the Randall Cunningham to Fred Barnett combination and coupled with the Eric Allen pick six pretty much sealed the deal for the Saints on that Saturday afternoon.
Yes, and in addition to that, Reggie White had a sack Bobby Hebert for a safety in that game too. So
that's right.
It just seems like it was like, okay, we played 45 minutes and they just forgot that it was a 60-minute game. And to your point, it was like, were they going to do it this year? It's like they could, because you have to remember, okay, the Niners were aging and aged, because I think this was the beginning of the Steve Young era, if I remember correctly.
Yes, it was.
And then this was kind of the beginning of the Cowboys, kind of their Super Bowl run. So at that point, I think they had finally gotten back to the playoffs the year before, but that was the year when they lost to Detroit in the playoffs, highlighted by that memorable Bear Sanders run through them all in the playoffs and all of that, where all 11 had a chance to tackle him but couldn't seem to get him down. But my point is, the Cowboys were relatively inexperienced at that time.
Right.
So, you were an experienced ball club in terms of at least the playoffs were concerned. So, you had a chance there, and this was still the middle of the NFC dominance in the Super Bowl over the AFC. So, it was really at that time, usually the de facto championship game would generally be, with the exception of a couple of years, the de facto championship game was
the NFC
title game.
Right.
Pretty much,
that game, 93, that was 92, excuse me. That was that Montana's last year in San Francisco, or was that first year in Kansas City? I think 93 was his first year. I know he was there in 93. I know that for sure. 93 and 94 for sure. But wasn't sure if he was there in 92 or not. I think he might have been behind Young, or he was on his way to Kansas City. I might have taken a year off or something. I don't exactly remember how all of that transpired.
Well, what had happened was, he was serving in a backup capacity to Steve Young, because
that's right.
If you remember, in the year before, when the Giants ended the quest for the three-peat late in that ball game, after the Roger Craig fumble, he was rolling out, and Leonard Marshall put a big time hit on him and forced him to fumble the ball, injuring his elbow in the process. So he had to have sort of like off-season elbow surgery, which prompted Steve Young to the starting quarterback position.
Yeah.
But then you remember, kind of like, to your point, it was kind of like very similar to the Cowboy game, not getting too far off the subject, against the Cowboys. It was very akin to that loss that the Colts had versus was that the Chiefs? It was I think it was the Jets, Super Bowl III. Remember?
Right.
That Earl Morrall was the starting quarterback, and the aged Johnny Unitas was still in the backup. But as the game progress. It was cries for them to put
Go to Unitas, right?
go to Unitas, and in this case, Montana. But they didn't have it as you saw once they got the other stops. Even though Joe was still solid in Kansas City, he
Right.
was injured coming off elbow surgery and all
It
of
wasn't the
that.
same,
So,
right?
so he was there, and then that following season was when he and Marcus Allen both got started in Kansas City under Marty Schottenheimer.
Schottenheimer, right? So after '92, they lose to the Eagles 36-20. So now at this point, the Saints are 0-4 in the playoffs. Okay. They haven't won a playoff game. They've had chances in these playoff games, but blown the leads. And that would be the last playoff appearance during the Jim Mora era of the New Orleans Saints. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but they wouldn't return to the playoffs until 2000. Am I correct on that?
That's, you are correct. That's 2000. Jim Haslett's first year. They beat
The
the
Rams.
defending champion St. Louis Rams in the Superdome on December 31st, the year 2000. Reason why I remember that, I happened to be at that game.
Right.
My brother.
See, that's the reason why. See,
and
that's the reason why I brought that up, folks. Was that you told me the story before?
I was at the game, and I still remember they hadn't won the playoff game yet, and the Saints behind. Boy, these some names from the past.
Aaron Brooks.
Aaron Brooks.
Aaron Brooks.
Joe Horn got hurt early in the game. He had
Right.
sprained his ankle or something. They had him, and then they had then he was going to Willie Jackson. Willie Jackson just went
Yeah.
off. And
Yeah.
then I still remember sitting in the stands. I was sitting like in the 200 level. It was New Year's Eve. The Saints were up by like 17 in the fourth with like 8 to go. People started leaving. They were like, well, we're going, hope you enjoyed your holidays, enjoy your new year. We're like, look, man, these are the damn Saints. This is never over, right?
Right.
Then, surely enough, right on cue, the darn
Kurt
Saints.
Warner goes off.
Kurt
Marshall
Warner,
Faulk.
Isaac Bruce, Torrey Holt, Marshall Faulk. They go right down. They go right down. Bang, bang, bang. Then the Saints are holding on desperately to a 3-point lead. It's inside of 2 minutes. Third down. Aaron Brooks throws the ball that people believe is complete, which would give the Saints the first down. Rams didn't have any more timeouts left. The game is over. They went to review. They ruled the pass incomplete. Fourth down. The Saints have to punt the football. So everybody like, oh, because if Kurt Warner get it back, the Saints are going to lose yet again.
Yep.
But when they punted the ball off, the Isaac Key, and he fumbled it, and the Saints recovered it, which sealed the
win.
The game and the first win in playoffs history. And Bedlam ensues inside the Superdome. People went crazy.
Exactly. I remember watching that game with some friends of mine. That game, and one of those friends of mine is Canadian, and that was the first playoff game she ever watched in real time because she never really followed the NFL, and she became a Saints fan. She is still a Saints fan to this day because of that game, because she said she had never seen a game that exciting before. To finish off 93, they start off 5-0. So you're thinking, okay, this could be something, but then again, they lose 8 of their last 11 games to finish 8-8. By this time, you have the ascension of the 49ers and Cowboys and the beginning of that great rivalry right there. The Falcons are the Falcons, within the division, but still, the Saints you're starting to see age and time start to catch up with this team. 94, their first losing season since 1986. At this point, okay, this may be really over now. Because I remember they acquired, did they acquire Jim Everett from the Rams right at the beginning of that year?
They did, but remember the year before, 93, just to touch on that briefly, when they jumped out to 5-0, they had Wade Wilson from the Vikings.
Yes.
And then they started out 5-0, and then surely enough, right on schedule, they fell apart. And then remember, it was publicly marred by an ugly what was it? It was an ugly what was it? What was the game against? I want to say maybe against the Rams, if I remember correctly. It was an ugly Monday night game in which they were losing. Wade Wilson gets hurt on Monday Night Football, and remember the Saints, the whole Superdome cheered
Right.
when he got hurt
When he
that
got hurt.
night.
That's right.
And then that led to one of Jim Mora's infamous tirades
Tirades.
again. They call them classless and devilish and all of that. And then to
Right.
your point, they went on to what was it, 94? And you say you think it's not over, dude. They had Mario Bates at running back. It was over. It was
Yeah.
over. Mario
Yeah.
Bates was a certified PhD in bumdom. He was garbage,
Yeah.
just garbage,
95, they finished 7-9 in the NFC West behind the expansion Carolina Panthers. Now you know it's over when you're finishing behind an expansion team. Now, granted, as you've listened to our episode before, the recent episode that we did about the Carolina Panthers and Jacksonville Jaguars, the Panthers has had the best record for a first-year expansion team ever, that particular year. But then the Mora era would end in 1996. He would resign after starting 2-6. And we finished with a record with the Saints of 93-78, 93 wins. Get this, was 3 more wins than the team had prior to his arrival. So you talk about a step forward in the history of the Saints team when you have 3 more wins during your tenure than the entire team had prior to your arrival. So kudos to Jim Mora. Of course, he would go on to coach the Colts in the beginning years of Peyton Manning's career. That year, 96, the Saints finished 3-13, which was their worst record since their 1-15 year of 1980. So the Jim Mora era, we've touched on it in the beginning that it was like the turning point of that franchise. And maybe you could speak on this a little bit, Chuck. Do you think if this era would not have happened, would the Saints still be in New Orleans?
Probably not, because they were awful. And then you also got to remember they had built some respectability around that time, and then they were at least like a somewhat respectful franchise. They were awful in the Ditka era. They were bad but respectable throughout the majority of the Haslett era, highlighted by the first playoff win. And then, that was around the time when Katrina happened and, Benson tried to snake oil salesman. You remember the San Antonio, they were like, well, we just borrowed the team. And then they, in fact, tried to take the team. And then, even though I don't like this guy, as in Roger Goodell, he stood up for New Orleans. He forced them to keep the Saints there. Now, just to go back just a little bit on the tail end of the Mora era, you remember they had right before he quit, they lost the Cardinals 28-14 to fall to 2-6, and then that was the famous Diddley Poo tirade. When what happened was the second game we got our ass kicked. The second game we just got our ass totally kicked. We couldn't do diddly poo offensively. We couldn't make a first down. We couldn't run the ball. We didn't try to run the ball. We couldn't complete a pass. We sucked. The second half we sucked. We couldn't stop the run. Every time they got the ball, they went down and got points. We got our ass totally kicked in the second half. That's what it boiled down to. It was a horseshit performance in the second half. Horseshit. I'm totally embarrassed and totally ashamed. Coaching, intelligible. Coaching did a horrible job. The players did a horrible job. We got our ass kicked in that second half. It sucked. It stunk. That's as simple as I can tell you. Then the next day, he said, I'm out. He's like, I've had enough of the Saints. They done drove me to drink. I'm gone. I'm up.
Wow.
So,
yeah, it was such just an inglorious end to that era. No one knew what was coming on the horizon in 10 years. No one really knew what was on the horizon in the next 10 years. and then eventually winning Super Bowl 44, you know, and I remember that era fondly because that was when, my grandpa was still around. He was a diehard Saints fan, and I can remember those playoff games with him and how invested he was in those teams and how, you know, his favorite player was Ironhead Hayward just because of the nickname Ironhead. He was a big Craig Ironhead Hayward fan from the University of Pittsburgh. Um, just it was just a magical time, in New Orleans, really, in that era in during the late '80s, early '90s. I mean, you were there, you remember. It was just a really great time to just be a part of that area during that time. This was pre-Katrina. This was, it was just such of a magical time, and the Saints were just a integral part of that magical time.
Yeah, and I remember it too because he changed the trajectory of the franchise. He actually made New Orleans, most importantly, a place where some, not the biggest free agents, but some free agents would give the Saints a look before they're looking for their final payout prior to
Right,
exiting the league and all of that.
right.
And then I also remember he made the Saints watchable. Quick
Yeah,
story time because I told you, like my dad was a big time Tom Landry Cowboy fan, and he hated the Saints because he said all the Saints were stopping you from watching a good game. That's all they're good for. And I'll never forget the Cowboys played like the 49ers or something. And once again, it was one of those sellout situations. It was the Saints came home because they sold out at the last minute. Now we had cable TV. My dad stripped the cable to try to go to the old UHF, and it was pouring down, storming, raining outside. He made me go outside, climb atop the roof. We had this big antenna up there. It's
right.
raining. Now I could get struck by lightning. I'm tingling. I'm trying to tingle with the antenna outside so he could find another, the UHF dial. You could have a
Yeah,
gazillion channels while
yeah,
he's turning the nub in hopes, even trying to get a grainy picture of the Cowboys 49er game or whatever. And I'm drenched wet, I'm cold, and just everything. You know what type of guy my dad was. Rest in
yeah,
peace, Father.
yeah,
But
yeah.
anyway, when Mora came and the Saints would actually come on, even though he wasn't thrilled about it, he like, well, they actually play a decent brand of football now. I can actually sit down and watch it. So,
Right.
he brought some respectability and some dignity to New Orleans in a variety of ways.
My grandpa was going to watch the Saints game by hook or crook because he was a big Saints fan. My dad, not so much. My dad's a Raider fan, and
Hmm.
that's the only time my dad would watch the Saints is if the Raiders were playing. Other than that, the Raiders on TV. No, I'm going to do something else. That was him. You
He's
know,
on attention, huh?
he gonna do something. He gonna probably gonna build something in his shop or something. But
Yeah.
anyway, we're gonna take a quick break and then we're gonna come right back and we're gonna close out the show with the Who Dat chant. Where did it come from? And the origin actually predates the NFL. So we're gonna talk about that, and it's gonna make a couple of Southern University alums proud of a part of its origin. And we're going to be talking about this right after this short break, right here on the Sports History Network. You're listening to the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. All right, all
Okay.
right. That's what we're talking about. That's what we're talking
Yeah,
about.
you can't talk about Jim Mora without the rants, man.
No, you can't. You're right. You're right. I'm glad you brought that in. I'm glad you
But
brought that in.
oh God, but unbelievably as good as those two were, the playoffs.
Yeah, everybody
That
knows
was the
that one.
culture.
Everybody knows that one. Everybody knows that
And
one.
the playoffs. Man, he had some legendary rants though, man. So yeah, he's a great coach though. His son, not so much, but he
His
was a
son, not
great
so
coach.
much, right?
He was a very good coach.
Yeah, yeah. He coached you at UCLA for a while and not so good. UCLA hasn't had a decent coach since Terry Donahue.
Oh, that's been 30 years.
Yep, not since Terry
That's been 30
Donahue.
years. Yeah.
Yeah.
Eric
Now,
Bieniemy still over there messing around.
who that?
Eric
Bieniemy?
Bieniemy, he's still over there messing around.
The offensive coordinator now is Rick Neuheisel's son.
I ain't never liked Lou Heisel, man. He tore Colorado up back in the days.
Yeah, it was Rick Neuheisel's son, who did a pretty good job. I mean, he was the offensive coordinator of his first game yesterday when they beat Penn State. Now I don't like the offense he runs because the quarterback runs too damn much. But what else have you got? But we take a win. The Bruins 0-4. But now they're 1-4. But they're playing in the Big Ten now, which they're not a Big Ten team. Never were. They're patterned.
They're not built. They're not built for that.
They're not built that way. If they play like in the Mountain West, then yeah, they can survive. But Big Ten, no, they're not ready for that kind of competition. But let's go ahead. Let's finish this off, man.
Let's go.
So that way I can start editing and stuff. And I'll probably have this out by hopefully either tomorrow afternoon or for sure Tuesday sometime. It depends on how my work schedule is tomorrow. So,
all right, cool.
All right, let's kick this off. And we're back, and you're listening to the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. I'm Dana Augusta, along with Charles Combs, and we are doing our shout-out segment. And the shout-out for this episode is Who Dat. Around the country, people know the Saints with the Who Dat chant. Now, Who Dat is not only with the Saints and it's synonymous with the Saints, but it's also synonymous with the city of New Orleans. In fact, so much so the earliest documented use of the Who Dat chant, according to the New Orleans Times newspaper on July 30th, 1852. It was originated in minstrel and vaudeville shows in the late 19th and early 20th century. It was taken up later on by jazz musicians in the 1920s and the 1930s, but it really didn't hit the sports area, the sports genre, I should say, until the 1960s and early 1970s. Now, when you get stories like this, and whenever you have folklore and sports folklore, you kind of have to take some of the origin stories and some of the backstories with a grain of salt. But I happen to know this from personal conversations with people, especially my dad and my uncle, who attended Southern University during the mid-60s. They used to have the Who Dat chant from Southern University in the 1960s. Who Dat said they're going to beat those Jags. That was the chant. But that started in the 1960s, as well as St. Augustine High School in New Orleans. Now, Chuck, you're from Baton Rouge, which is right up the street from New Orleans. I've always wondered this. Which is the correct pronunciation of St. Augustine High School? Is it St. Augustine or St. Augustine? Because I heard it both ways. Do you know for sure?
I've always heard St. Augustine. I've never heard St. Augustine. Man, we in Louisiana, man. Nobody going to say St. Augustine. It's St. Augustine, man. But you probably actually write the proper pronunciation, but the Louisiana pronunciation, especially by us black folks and then our Cajun brothers from another mother, is going to be
St. Augustine
every single time.
Yeah. Well, my wife's maiden name is Augustine, but I've heard it pronounced St. Augustine too. When you call my wife Augustine or her mom, you're in for a fight. But they pronounce it St. Augustine, but I've heard it pronounced different ways. I've always wondered what was the correct pronunciation of that. But anyway, you have a lot of different schools claiming to be the origin of it. Southern claims it. LSU has a little bit of a claim. Alcorn State in Mississippi has a claim. All of this other stuff. But the earliest document as far as sports was concerned is in the 1960s with Southern University and St. Augustine High School, which a lot of Southern University band members and students and football players, a lot of them came from the New Orleans Catholic League, i.e. St. Augustine High School. Now, the Saints first used it in a song. Now, you got to go to 1983. This was the year where the Saints came very close to making the playoffs. We talked about it earlier in this show, how they came very close, losing to the Rams on the last play of the last regular season game of that year. But that year, Aaron Neville, the Grammy Award-winning singer, along with a few New Orleans musicians, as well as a few New Orleans Saints players, came up with a song called "When the Saints Go Marching In, Who Dat Say They're Gonna Beat Those Saints." Now, it's all put together by a broadcaster, a sports broadcaster in New Orleans, who's very famous for something else. His name was Ron Swoboda. And if that name sounds familiar to baseball fans, that is the same one. Ron Swoboda, the former right fielder for the Miracle 1969 New York Mets World Series champion team, who made one of the most dramatic catches in World Series history, was the sports director at one of the television stations. And he put together Aaron Neville and the Saints players and a couple of Saints teams called "When the Saints Go Marching In," and then the Saints players would come in and do the chorus of the song, basically say, who that say they're going to beat those Saints. And it caught on like wildfire. In fact, I remember when I was a kid in 1983, I was 10 years old, and riding the bus to school, and you would listen to the radio riding on the bus to school, and one of the local state radio stations would play that song after every Saints win. Like every hour on the hour, they would play that song. And that became the origin of the Saints Who Dat Chant. What do you think of that?
I think that's totally accurate because I've always heard similar origins from people that I've spoken to as well, that it always was a 1960s term in terms of Southern University football, and then it was also embraced by St. Augustine as well, and like in the late 60s and throughout the 70s as well. And then
Yeah.
eventually in that time during the 70s and all that, because the Saints didn't come into existence until 67. So
Right.
throughout the 70s, then it eventually morphed. It became a term for the Saints. And then an additional expansion in terms of the Who Dat Chant, which I didn't know either, and a little bit in my research, they were saying that even LSU had a
Yeah.
Who Dat Chant like in March '81, because you remember that's Dale Brown, what's that boy name? Howard High C Carter,
Yeah.
Swat Mitchell, and Derek Taylor, all them ballers made the Final Four that year in
Yep.
1981 to go
Yep.
against Isaiah Thomas and Indiana
Indiana.
Hoosiers. But
Yep.
anyway, they also they had a Who Dat tune written to the tune of, get this, Frankie Smith. Remember this hip hop classic, the Double Dutch Bus.
Yep. Uh-huh.
And they had it. They had a song, a Who Dat song written to that. They did that as well. So I totally agree with that because it's always been a part of Louisiana fandom, Louisiana culture, regardless, at the high school level, at the college level, and then obviously with the Saints.
Right. Now, there's a big controversy between two fan bases of who started it first. Was
Not
it the
to me.
Saints? That's okay. Well, according to some fans, I should say that the Who Dey chant in Cincinnati, who they say they're going to beat those Bengals, nobody, which to me I think is lame. That's just a personal opinion. But the lore, according to the Who Dey chant, goes like this, and I'm reading this from Wikipedia. Saying Who Dey at Bengals games is steeped in local beer lore. Who Dey, a leading product of Who Dey Pool Brewing Company, 1978. People in the stands would chant Who Dey to get beer. Eventually, I think, according to this, it morphed into Who Dey say they're going to beat those Bengals, which coincided with the 1980 Cincinnati Bengals, 1 year from making their run to go to the Super Bowl. So again, this is Wikipedia. I don't know how much you could trust this, but According to the full Who Dey chant was first known to be used by the fans of the 1980 Bengals, while the origin of the chant is disputed. One possible source for the chant is a 1980 commercial for the now defunct Red Fraser Ford of Cincinnati, which used the tagline, "Who is going to give you a better deal than Fraser? Nobody." So they just took it from there. So they kind of morphed two things together. The chant appears some of the series of Who Dat, which was officially adopted by the Saints in '83, but according to Wikipedia, Who Dey was from 1980. Who Dat, for the Saints at least, was from 1983, but the origin goes way further back than that. So maybe Cincinnati got a claim. If they do, I guess it's okay. But in my opinion, Who Dat is a better chant. Way, way better than Who Dey. It sounds, it's lame. In my opinion, it's just lame. I'm sorry. If any Bengals fans are out there, it's just my own personal opinion. Growing up, especially for someone who grew up in Louisiana, I just think it's lame.
Well, and to anybody that we possibly have in Cincinnati as well, I'm not quite as diplomatic, as Ric Flair would say, the nature boy, as he would say, there's only two things you can do. You can love it or you can learn to love it. Because it started in the 1960s, as far as from a sports standpoint, and that's clear as day, and that's been hugely and formally documented. And then besides, I'm not trying to rain on them because I got one of my best friends live in Cincinnati, but the Who Dey chant is lame, corny, and contrived. It's lame. So first of all, you see somebody, you say Who Dat. You ain't gonna say Who Dey. That's even from a grammatical standpoint, that sounds stupid. You know what I mean? Then, in addition to that, you suckers been bit twice. Because not only have you bit the Who Dat chant from the Saints, then even the nobody, you stole that from the 49ers. Because, the 49ers, they're famous for saying, "Who's got it better than us? Nobody." You stole that too. And that's why and then you obviously stole it because they whooped you in the Super Bowl twice. So you just, it's lame, man. It's just, but it's lame and it's mad corny, man. It's just, but really, it's really just a debate by Cincinnati fans, because we don't even acknowledge this, man. Real fans get the money, fronting fans get the seats. Shout out to Mobb Deep, by the way.
All right, that's it.
But anyway, but just. It's always been a staple of Louisiana culture and Saints culture and all of that. But all jokes aside, I got respect for the Bengals because, we got a lot of LSU boys up there. If y'all can block for Joe Burrow, you could probably get something done out of it, get offensive line to protect them and all of that. Got some LSU boys up there getting it done. And that's just my 2 cents. Nothing personal. This is just business.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, that will do it for this edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. Thanks everyone out there for listening. Once again, this podcast comes to you from the Bill King Memorial Studio in the sports wing of TM4 Enterprises, located in suburban Atlanta in the shadow of Stone Mountain. And please don't forget to subscribe to the show. If you like our content, you could write to the show at historically.speaking.sports@gmail.com. And finally, as always, tell people about us. Tell your family, tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell your coworkers. Hell, tell a passerby on the street if you think that they like sports history. Once again, on behalf of Charles Combs, my co-host, I'm Dana Auguster. Thanks once again for joining us. Peace.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
The Sports History Network, where legends live on and the past plays loud.
Welcome to the place where history's proud. From gridiron glory to the hardwood stars, from the racetrack heat to Olympic bars. It's the voices, the stories, the moments you miss, told by fans and pros who live for this. Hook and Themic, the Sports History Network, where the past comes alive. Podcasts and blogs that keep the flame high. From Babe to Brady, Alley to the Dome. If it's history and sports, then this is the home. SportsHistoryNetwork.com, the headquarters of sports yesteryear.